No woman had ever made Ethan Blackwood stop and stare. Not the governor's daughter wrapped in expensive silk. Not the wealthy banker's niece who arrived in a shining carriage. Not even the beautiful women who traveled across mountains and plains hoping to become the wife of the richest cowboy in Wyoming Territory. Every one of them left disappointed. Some left angry, others left heartbroken. But Ethan Blackwood never changed. Winter of 1883 covered Wyoming in snow and ice. The wind screamed across the open prairie like a wounded animal searching for shelter. Most men hurried, home before sunset, eager to sit beside warm fireplaces. Ethan Blackwood rode directly into the storm. At 36 years old, he owned one of the largest ranches in the territory. Thousands of cattle carried his brand. Hundreds of workers depended on him. His wealth stretched farther than the eye could see. Yet none of it filled the emptiness inside him. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, Ethan carried himself like a man born to command. His dark hair showed traces of silver. His sharp gray eyes looked colder than the winter sky. Years of hard work had carved strength into every movement. People respected him. Some feared him. Very few truly knew him. The Blackwood Ranch mansion stood proudly on a hill overlooking endless land. It was a symbol of success, but Ethan often felt more comfortable in a cattle barn than inside its luxurious walls. Tonight another wealthy family waited in the grand parlor. Another father, another daughter, another attempt to convince him that marriage was the next logical step in his life. Ethan entered the room and instantly felt the familiar wave of exhaustion. Richard Caldwell, one of the territory's richest businessmen, stood beside his daughter Emily. The young woman was beautiful, with golden hair and elegant clothes that probably cost more than a ranch hand earned in a year. Richard smiled confidently. "Mr. Blackwood, my daughter has been educated in the finest schools. She plays piano beautifully and comes from one of the most respected families in the territory." Emily stepped forward with perfect grace. "It is an honor to meet you, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan looked at her quietly, before asking a simple question. "What do you know about me?" Emily blinked. The question clearly surprised her. "Well, everyone knows you are one of the most successful ranch owners in Wyoming." Ethan nodded slowly. "Anything else?" Emily hesitated. Her father quickly stepped in. "Success speaks for itself, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan gave a humorless smile. "That's what I thought." The room became uncomfortable. Richard cleared his throat. "A man in your position should think about marriage. Legacy matters." Ethan walked toward the fireplace and stared into the flames. "People keep telling me that." Richard forced a laugh. "Because it's true." Ethan turned around. His gray eyes were cold enough to freeze the room. "What if I don't want a wife chosen by business arrangements?" Richard's smile disappeared. Emily looked down at her hands. Ethan continued. "Every woman who comes here knows my bank account before she knows my favorite horse. They know the size of my ranch before they know anything about my heart. Tell me, honestly, Mr. Caldwell, would your daughter be standing here if I owned 50 acres instead of 50,000? Neither of them answered. Their silence spoke louder than words. Ethan walked to the front door and opened it. "I appreciate your visit. Have a safe journey home." 20 minutes later, their carriage disappeared down the snowy road. Ethan watched until it vanished completely. Another meeting. Another disappointment. Another reminder that nobody seemed interested in the man behind the fortune. By morning, the entire ranch knew another suitor had failed. Ranch hands joked about it while feeding cattle. "That's number 14 this month," laughed Jake Morgan, the foreman. 15, corrected Carlos Reyes. "You forgot the judge's daughter last week." The men chuckled, but beneath the humor was genuine concern. They respected Ethan deeply. He paid fair wages. He worked harder than anyone else. He never asked another man to do a job he wouldn't do himself. Yet they all noticed the loneliness following him like a shadow. Later that evening, Ethan stood alone on the porch, watching snow drift across the plains. The sky stretched endlessly above him. Somewhere beyond those distant hills were towns filled with families, laughter, and warm homes. Things he had spent years convincing himself he didn't need. But some nights the silence inside the mansion felt heavier than any burden he carried. Deep down, a small part of him still believed there might be someone different. Someone who didn't care about money. Someone who could see beyond the ranch, beyond the reputation, beyond the walls he had built around his heart. He immediately pushed the thought away. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. Yet as darkness settled over Wyoming and the wind whispered across the frozen land, Ethan Blackwood couldn't shake the strange feeling that his life was about to change forever. He didn't know that. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered horizon, a quiet young woman was already riding toward Blackwood Ranch. And unlike every woman before her, she wasn't coming for his wealth. She was coming for a reason that would challenge everything Ethan believed about love, trust, and the possibility of a second chance. The next morning arrived colder than the one before. A thick blanket of snow covered the prairie, turning the world into a sea of white silence. Ethan Blackwood woke before sunrise, as he always did. Routine was one of the few things he trusted. People changed. Promises broke. Feelings disappeared. But the work of a ranch remained the same. He pulled on his boots, buttoned his worn flannel shirt, and stepped outside into the freezing darkness. The air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. Years of hard living had taught him to ignore discomfort. He walked toward the barns where the ranch hands were already beginning their day. Horses snorted clouds of steam into the cold air while cattle gathered near the feeding areas. Everything seemed normal, yet Ethan couldn't explain the strange feeling sitting in the back of his mind. It felt as if something important was approaching, something unexpected. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Ethan stood near the front gate of the ranch, checking a section of fence damaged by snow. That was when he heard it. The distant sound of hoofbeats. Slow, steady, unhurried. Ethan straightened and looked toward the road. A single rider appeared through the morning mist. There was no fancy carriage, no servants, no wealthy father riding beside her. Just one person on horseback traveling alone across the frozen prairie. The horse was strong but ordinary. The rider wore a simple brown coat and a weathered hat pulled low against the wind. Ethan watched carefully as the rider approached the ranch gate. When the horse finally stopped, the rider climbed down smoothly. The movement was confident, natural, and practiced. Whoever this person was, they knew horses. They knew hard work. The figure tied the horse calmly before walking toward the ranch entrance. As she came closer, Ethan realized the rider was a young woman. She looked to be about 25 years old. Her face was pretty, but not in the polished way he was used to seeing. Her beauty felt real, honest, the kind shaped by sunlight, hard work, and resilience rather than expensive dresses and social events. Her brown eyes met his directly. There was no nervous flirting, no rehearsed smile, no attempt to impress him. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked politely. Ethan nodded. "That's me. My name is Clara Bennett." Her voice was soft but steady. "I was hoping I could speak with you for a few minutes." Ethan crossed his arms. "If this is about marriage, you're wasting your time." To his surprise, a small smile appeared on her face. "Then it's a good thing I didn't ride 3 days through a snowstorm to discuss marriage." Ethan blinked. That was certainly a first. Every woman who had come before either spoke about marriage immediately or pretended not to while clearly hoping for it. Clara did neither. "Then why are you here?" he asked. Clara glanced across the ranch. Her eyes studied the land, the barns, the workers in the distance. But unlike others, she didn't look impressed by the wealth surrounding her. Instead, she looked thoughtful, almost sad. Finally, she returned her attention to him. "Because I've heard stories about you." Ethan sighed. "Most people have." Not those kinds of stories. Ethan frowned. What kinds then? Clara hesitated before answering. The stories about the man who built all of this, from nothing. The man who worked until his hands bled. The man who lost more than most people know. Ethan's expression hardened instantly. Very few people knew anything about his past. Even fewer dared mention it. Who told you those stories? He asked quietly. An old ranch hand named Walter Hayes. He worked beside my father years ago. Ethan remembered Walter. The old cowboy had retired almost 10 years earlier. And why would those stories bring you here? Clara looked down briefly before answering. When she raised her eyes again, Ethan saw something there he hadn't expected. Pain. Real pain. The kind that comes from experience. Because I know what loneliness looks like. The words landed harder than they should have. Ethan suddenly found himself unable to look away from her face. Clara continued softly. I lost my parents 3 winters ago. Then my younger brother died from fever the following year. Since then, I've been managing our small farm alone. Ethan remained silent. Clara wasn't speaking like someone seeking sympathy. She was simply stating facts. Facts that had clearly changed her life forever. Most people look at loneliness and run from it, she said. But when you've lived with it long enough, you start recognizing it in others. A cold wind swept across the ranch. Neither of them moved. Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Not attraction. Not yet. Something deeper. Curiosity. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely interested in what another person had to say. Clara smiled gently. You're probably wondering why a stranger would tell you all this. Ethan nodded. The thought crossed my mind. Because, she replied, I don't think you've spoken honestly with anyone in a very long time. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but stopped. The truth of her words hit harder than he wanted to admit. People spoke to Ethan Blackwood every day. Workers, business partners, neighbors, visitors. But nobody truly spoke to him. They spoke to the wealthy ranch owner, the powerful businessman, the man everyone thought they knew. Very few ever tried to know Ethan himself. Clara took a small step backward. I've probably kept you long enough. Ethan surprised himself by answering immediately. You haven't. She looked at him with quiet surprise. Ethan cleared his throat. If you rode 3 days through a snowstorm, the least I can do is offer you coffee before you head back. For the first time, Clara's smile reached her eyes. It transformed her entire face. And as Ethan Blackwood looked at the quiet young woman standing before him, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. A small spark, fragile and dangerous, but alive. And neither of them knew that this simple conversation at a ranch gate was about to change both of their lives forever. Ethan Blackwood led Clara Bennett into the large ranch house, something he had not done willingly for any visiting woman in years. The moment they stepped inside, several ranch hands exchanged surprised looks through the windows. News traveled fast on a ranch, and by sunset everyone would know that the wealthy cowboy who rejected every bride had invited a quiet stranger inside for coffee. Ethan ignored the thought and guided Clara toward the kitchen. Unlike the grand rooms filled with expensive furniture, the kitchen felt warm and honest. A fire burned softly in the stove, while the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Clara removed her coat and carefully folded it over a chair. Ethan noticed patches sewn into the sleeves. They were neat repairs done by someone who valued hard work over appearances. Most women who visited his ranch wore dresses worth hundreds of dollars. Clara wore clothes that told the story of survival. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. Thank you, she said. They sat across from each other in silence for a moment. Surprisingly, it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan had spent years enduring conversations filled with fake compliments, and carefully planned questions about his wealth. Sitting with Clara felt different, peaceful, real. "So," Ethan finally said, "what exactly were you hoping to find when you came here?" Clara wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "Honestly?" Ethan nodded. "Honestly, I wasn't sure." A faint smile appeared on her lips. "Part of me expected the stories to be wrong. I thought maybe I'd find another wealthy ranch owner who cared only about money and reputation." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And instead?" Clara looked directly into his eyes. "Instead, I found a man who seems tired of being misunderstood." The words struck deeper than Ethan expected. For years, people had described him as cold, stubborn, intimidating, arrogant, and impossible to please. Nobody had ever described him as tired. Yet that single word felt more accurate than all the others combined. "You make a lot of assumptions for someone. You've only known an hour," Ethan said. Clara laughed softly. It was a genuine laugh, warm and natural. Ethan realized he couldn't remember the last time he had heard a sound like that inside this house. "Maybe," she admitted. "Or maybe pain recognizes pain." Ethan stared into his coffee. Memories he normally kept buried began rising to the surface. The years of struggle, the hunger, the losses, the endless pressure of carrying responsibilities alone. Building an empire had earned him respect, but it had also built walls around his life. Walls so high that eventually nobody could reach him, not even himself. Clara seemed to sense his thoughts. "My father used to say something," she said quietly. "What was that?" "He said the strongest people often become prisoners of their own strength. They carry everything themselves because they stop believing anyone else can help." Ethan slowly looked up. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller. The silence between them felt heavier, because she wasn't wrong. For years he had carried every burden alone, every problem, every loss, every fear. He trusted nobody enough to share the weight. It was easier that way, safer. Yet sitting across from Clara, Ethan found himself wondering whether safety and loneliness had become the same thing. Outside, snow began falling again. White flakes drifted past the windows while the wind whispered across the ranch. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "What's that?" Ethan asked. "A letter." "From who?" Clara hesitated. "My brother." Ethan frowned. "I thought you said he passed away." "He did." Her voice softened. "This was the last letter he ever wrote to me." Carefully, she unfolded the worn paper. "Whenever life becomes difficult, I read it again." Ethan watched her expression change as she glanced at the faded words. There was sadness there, but also love. Deep and enduring. "What does it say?" he asked. Clara smiled gently. "It says that no matter how dark life becomes, people should never close their hearts completely. Because sometimes the thing we've been waiting for arrives when we least expect it." Ethan felt those words settle deep inside him. He thought about the endless parade of women who had come seeking his wealth. He thought about the walls he had built around his heart. Then he looked at Clara Bennett, a woman who arrived alone on horseback, a woman who asked for nothing, a woman who saw him more clearly after a few hours than others had after years. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt something changing inside him, not all at once. Not enough to erase years of pain, but enough to create a small crack in the walls surrounding his heart. Clara stood and picked up her coat. "I should leave before the storm gets worse." Ethan immediately stood as well. Something inside him resisted the idea of watching her ride away. He walked her to the front door. Snow swirled across the ranch yard as they stepped onto the porch. Clara pulled on her gloves and prepared to leave. Then she turned back toward him. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan smiled slightly. "Call me Ethan." Clara's eyes widened with surprise before a warm smile appeared. "Then thank you, Ethan." She mounted her horse and rode slowly toward the gate. Ethan remained on the porch long after she disappeared into the falling snow. For years, every visitor had left his ranch exactly the same way they arrived. Forgotten, meaningless, temporary. But Clara Bennett was different. As Ethan stood watching the storm swallow the distant road, he realized something that both excited and terrified him. For the first time in years, he hoped she would come back. And somewhere beyond the snow-covered hills, Clara Bennett carried the same hope in her heart. Their story had only just begun. The lonely cowboy didn't know it yet, but the quiet young woman who approached his gate was about to change his life forever.